Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton, with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of January 30th, 2025. We are coming to you this week from the Digital Sabbath Division here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House, overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. My very special guest today is author and historian Christine Rosen, who joins me to talk about her new book on the ways technology is changing what it means to be human. Christine Rosen is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on American history, society and culture, technology and culture, and feminism. Concurrently, she is a columnist for Commentary Magazine and one of the co-hosts of the Commentary Magazine podcast. She is also a fellow at the University of Virginia's Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture and a senior editor in an advisory position at the New Atlantis. Christine Rosen holds a PhD in history with a major in American intellectual history from Emory University and a BA in history from the University of South Florida. She is the author or co-author of a number of books, including one entitled Acculturated: 23 Savvy Writers Find Hidden Virtue in Reality TV, Chick Lit, Video Games, and Other Pillars of Pop Culture, published by Templeton Press in 2011, written with Naomi Schaefer Riley. A book entitled My Fundamentalist Education, a Memoir of a Divine Girlhood, published by Public Affairs in 2005, which was named one of the best nonfiction books of the year by the Washington Post. And one entitled Preaching Eugenics, Religious Leaders and the American Eugenics Movement, published by Oxford University Press in 2004. Her opinion pieces, articles, and reviews have appeared in a host of national publications, including the Christian Science Monitor, the New York Daily News, the Los Angeles Times, National Review, the New Republic, the New York Times, Politico, Slate, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New England Journal of Medicine, among many, many others. Her broadcast appearances include ABC News, CBS News and NBC News, BBC News, CNN, C-SPAN, Fox News, MSNBC, PBS News, and National Public Radio. She has testified before Congress and the U.S. Secretary of Education's Commission on Opportunity in Athletics. Her latest book, and the one she is here to talk about with me today, is entitled The Extinction of Experience: Being Human in a Disembodied World, published on September 10th, 2024 by WW Norton. It was reviewed in the Washington Post on September 27th and in the Wall Street Journal on October 7th. It was chosen by Esquire as one of the best books of 2024. It's a book about the price that we as humans are paying for the virtual technology that we all use to mediate our lives, and it is both fascinating and frightening. My conversation with Christine Rosen begins now. Christine Rosen, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
You have written an extraordinary book called The Extinction of Experience, and I want to start out with a quote. I'm a fan of old movies, and this is a quote from the 1960 movie Inherit the Wind, which was about the Scopes monkey trial. And these words were said by Spencer Tracy, who was playing, of course, the Clarence Darrow lawyer in there. But he says to the jury at one point, because they're arguing about science versus religion, and he says, and I quote here, "Progress has never been a bargain. You have to pay for it. Sometimes I think there's a man who sits behind a counter and says, all right, you can have a telephone, but you lose privacy and the charm of distance. Mister, you may conquer the air, but the birds will lose their wonder and the clouds will smell of gasoline." That quote came to mind as I read your book. And I read many book reviews. I discovered your book on the Wall Street Journal. And among many of the reviews, one of them said that, and many of them said this actually, or some version of this is a sweeping condemnation of digital technologies. And I don't think that's what this is at all. You're not dismissing or condemning digital technologies. You're challenging us, I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, that we need to figure out how to live with these in a way that does not destroy what it means to be human. So that's a long setup. I'm going to tee that up for you.
I like that. No, I like this setup because actually you're correct. I think in a way it's more, I hope I'm not doing any too much sweeping condemnation of anything or anyone, but in fact, it's more of an indictment or I hope, helpful reminder of some of the proclivities of human nature. And
Hmm.
so the way that we interact with any new thing, whether it be a smartphone or back in the day, a telephone or a radio or a television, human nature is has some more fixed principles and fixed range of behaviors. And so when we adapt, we have to think through some of the ways that we work rather than looking to the technology to correct for human nature, or to, as many of our technologists promise us, to eliminate the worst parts of human nature, or to eliminate the worst parts of what it means to be human, like having to wait, having to live inside frail and flawed human physical bodies. So in that sense, yeah, I think it's really a story that's more about us as human beings than it is necessarily only about technology.
And you're a trained historian, and so you know, and you do reference this throughout your book that we as human beings have always had to adapt to new technologies, and we don't always do it well, and some people get completely run over by technology. But this is not a Jeremiah. You kids get off my lawn and get your face out of your phone. It's much more complex than that and far-reaching than that. I don't know where it
I
started. I don't know what if there was something that you got behind a pack of kids who were not looking up at the Mona Lisa, for instance, and you wanted them out of their phone. But it's much more than that.
Well, I am, some of this is, of course, colored by my generational perspective. I'm Gen X, so I came of age without all of this stuff and didn't
Hmm.
start to really use computers until I was a graduate student. Didn't have a cell phone, an old brick cell phone for much, much longer. And so I did, I know the before times, but I've also, my children are 18 years old now. So like I've raised kids throughout the digital era, and so watched how their experience is very different. I think for me, the thing that really prompted the writing of this book, I've studied technology and new technologies and new platforms for more than 20 years. Long before Facebook, I was looking at MySpace and some of these early social media platforms, early online dating sites, all this stuff. And what I saw, the constant thread with a lot of this, was an attempt to deny certain realities about how humans interact, how humans connect. And the promise of what our technologists created was so amazing, right? We'll connect, we'll have these more fruitful discussions with people all around the world. Our politics will become one big group hug. And I say this slightly sarcastically now, but if you go back 10, 15 years, you'll see this kind of language used about connection and coming together and
Hmm.
the long tail of all these things. So there was a hopefulness which throughout American history, Americans have been some of the most enthusiastic early adopters of new things, and we figure we can just work out the kinks along the way, right? We're like adopt the new thing, go with it. We're an innovative entrepreneurial country, and we'll figure out what the downstream effects later. That's
Hmm.
largely worked for a lot of technologies, but what's new about these technologies is how short the time span is between when they come onto the market, when they become adopted and ubiquitous, and how much we invite them into our private lives and our private homes. So it's quite different from a television where you can sit and watch, and there were three channels, and then you turn it off, and everyone would
Hmm.
sit together and do this group activity. Now we carry these things on our physical bodies most of the day. It's the first thing we touch in the morning and the last thing we touch at night. People use them as clocks. So they are much more embedded in our mundane daily existence in a way that I think invites some new questions that we should ask about how it changes our behavior and our mindset.
One of the reviews that I read, and I don't remember where it was, and this was not uncommon in the reviews, and it seems to me this is really oversimplifying things. That some of the people said, but for all that, it's just a matter of turn your phone off and put it in your pocket, and then all these problems go away. But it's much, much deeper than that, I think, and you make that case. I think that you say repeatedly, this isn't really. First of all, it's far more than just the cell phone, which is, I
Right.
think, the most ubiquitous way that we see this every day in our lives. It's more about technology and letting it sort of take the place of human experience and the way that we interact with each other. We don't even trust, you say many times, our own experiences anymore.
Yes, this was where, my favorite criticism, by the way, was the reviewer who was very libertarian, who suggested that I was trying to bring back smallpox because, I just must hate all technology. So, no, I
Right.
want to assure your listeners, I
Yeah.
do not want to see the return of smallpox.
Right. Right.
But you're right in the sense that one of the things I've noticed when you start thinking about habits of mind and how people see the world, the way that their worlds are sort of crafted for them from a very young age and as they come into adulthood in particular, and the expectations they have for their own and others' behavior. When you're raised constantly testing your own persona against an outside world, whether that's because you're on Instagram and you want to get a certain number of followers or likes, or whether you're, on social media platforms that encourage you to react instantaneously to very complex issues and be on this team or that team, very Manichean ways of thinking. All of these things are creating a different sense of self. So in the 20th century, there were a lot of fascinating sociologists, Christopher Lasch in particular, but many, many others, who worried about the kind of sense of self that the modern world was encouraging people to have. And I think
Hmm.
those questions become even more important now that we have these phones, because the phone is, you can't just simply turn it off. The other day I had to try to find a parking spot and I couldn't park without having an app. So you have to download. So these very basic functions are being outsourced. But what we're doing as human beings is often checking our own instincts and impulses against what the technology tells us. And you see this most clearly in things like online dating sites, on social media, the presentation of self on social media, and what people's expectations become for not just their physical appearance, but their emotional experience. So, all of these things, these tools shape us. And again, we like to think of technology as neutral. The idea that technology is neutral is itself historically a creation. This is a myth that I think is long past the point of needing to be undone. But we create these myths to try to justify and adjust to new things. And I think right now we're seeing, particularly with the impact of social media on our politics, on young people's emotional and mental health, we're starting to see cracks in this idea that, oh, these are just neutral and it's all about self control. That's not quite right.
Hmm. And that you're some sort of Luddite if you don't not only embrace it, but admit that this is so much better. I want to read a quote, and it's a little bit of an extended quote, but I did a podcast a couple of years ago about I had seen something in the Washington Post about people who are terrified of talking on the phone for no reason. My mother
Yes.
called me out of, one afternoon and what's happening here?
How
I
dare you?
couldn't, yeah. We didn't text first and ask if it was okay the way you and I grew up, where if the phone
Right.
rang, you answered it, not knowing what you were going to get on the other end of the line. So you wrote, and this is right in the middle of the book, page 90, not long ago, and this is a quote, New York Times technology reporter Nick Bilton wrote a screed against what he called, quote, time-wasting forms of communication. For Bilton, who confesses that his preferred method of communication with his mother is Twitter, this includes most of the things that used to be called pleasantries. And here's his words. In the age of the smartphone, there's no reason to ask once acceptable questions. The weather forecast, a business phone number, a store's hours. But some people still do, he wrote. They take up bandwidth writing dear and yours sincerely in emails and placing landline phone calls. And you go on to say the problem isn't that he and others prefer a world without pleasantries. Such people have always existed. It's their expectation that efficiency in human interactions is innately superior, an ideal that society should embrace. And I think that's part of what this is not a condemnation of technology, but the fact that somehow there's this condescension that those of us who still want to say, hello, Christine, how are you, in an email are somehow wasting people's time and bandwidth, that
Yes,
that's where this is going.
this struck me, and this is persistent, and it's a broader issue. I think of it's two things. One is this idea that we should optimize every moment of our life, whether that's our what we're doing at work, even our leisure is supposed to be optimized, regulated, made more efficient and more productive, right? This sort of
Mm-hmm.
this
Mm-hmm.
lure of you can be super efficient, super productive, and half of the self-help and advice books on the market are giving you different ways to do that. That's fine up to a point. But what I think Bilton's comments and a lot of that mindset suggests is something else as well. And that's a world in which people start to conform to the demands of the machines and the tools rather than using technology for what it should be, which is an extension of ourselves, a way to help us be better humans. Now the humans are trying to become better machines in a way. And you can see that mindset shift in little moments like that. And again, I have wonderful friends in social science who are all about the data. They're like, well, that's just a qualitative observation. I'm like, you're right, it is. but it's a real experience for lots of people on a daily basis. If you're the kind of person who thinks it's good to grease the social wheels by being thoughtful and polite and exchanging pleasantries with people, say in a work environment, and you have a boss who thinks you should be very efficient, like a text message, you will clash. That is a clash of cultures inside the workplace. If you're a young Gen Z coming out of college and you're getting your first job and you don't have a lot of experience with face-to-face interactions with strangers and you're put in a public facing role for your job and you struggle, your bosses might not understand why. You might not even know why. And so you see this with these are cultural and worldview clashes. And my concern with the elimination of pleasantries and the optimization of everything is that we forget what it means. Again, humans need downtime. We need time to just kind of let our minds wander and to be a little bit lazy. This is a tough message for Americans in particular to embrace. But a full life is one that has room for some fallow time when you can rebuild, regenerate, and that's not just taking a nap. It means letting your mind wander and look into things that have no purpose, that have no optimization as its end goal, but just simply learning something new or, leisure time, true leisure time.
Hmm. So much to dive into here. After I read that passage, I was reminded, and you might not want to be compared to the great English historian E.P. Thompson. You may remember in his Making of the English Working Class, this is one of the most famous passages written, I think, in post-World War II history. I'm going to quote him here. He said, "I am seeking to rescue the poor stockinger, the Luddite cropper, the obsolete handloom weaver, the utopian artisan from the enormous condescension of posterity. Their crafts and traditions may have been dying. Their hostility to the new industrialism may have been backward looking. Their communitarian ideals may have been fantasies. But they lived through these times of acute social disturbance, and we did not. And he was determined to help us understand sort of the world, the pre industrial world. And these people
Hmm.
weren't just a bunch of people who refused to conform, that there was something valuable there. I don't know that you're trying to do exactly the same thing, and I don't mean to compare you to an English Marxist historian, which I know you're not, and you don't want to be. But I think there's something there. There's something that you're hanging this on. I think a historical tradition of asking people to pause before we just rush headlong and embrace everything and ask, in much the same way the quote at the beginning of this is, what is this going to do to us?
Right.
Signing on to all of these social media things. As you said, there's a difference between doing something for an experience and then putting pictures of it on Instagram versus doing something so you can put pictures on Instagram.
Right. This is actually these distinctions really matter, I would argue, because I think we tend when we get a new thing, a new technology, a new platform, and you see a lot of this in the current debate about artificial intelligence too. People say, "What can this do for me? What can this do for us? Like, look at all these things we can now do that we couldn't do before." And that's a perfectly legitimate thing to be enthusiastic about. But it should always include and be equally weighted, both morally and ethically in particular. What does it do to us? What's the opportunity cost? Sometimes we make these bargains and they're worth it, right? I'm glad that I can drive a car instead of a buggy. It's just
Mm-hmm.
more, I can get more places more readily. But there are trade-offs to all of these things. So when we only look at the what does it do for us and don't also ask what does it do to us, we're missing that aspect of it. And then this is where I do become apolitical, but in terms of sensibility, very deeply conservative by nature and temperament. And that's to say, every new thing is not necessarily an improvement. And it's very difficult to make that argument in the American context in particular, because we want to believe that each new thing is an improvement. We want to see history as this arc of us just marching towards progress at all times. But the more you study history, the more you realize that is a horrible conceit, and it leads to sometimes really tragic ends when the assumption is, oh, we can shape human nature, oh, we can control populations that we've decided at this point in time are troublesome and we'll define them this way scientifically. There's a whole history of humans hubris in this regard, and Silicon Valley strikes me as being a mindset and a way of doing things that is governed largely not just by idealism and futuristic visions of what's possible, but also by hubris. And so we need to temper that hubris with some thoughtful, humane ways of understanding that not every one of these new projects is going to be good for us. There will always be people who profit from those sorts of things. And we know this from what technology companies' earnings and revenues are compared to,
Mm-hmm.
sort of what as users, again, we are called users. That's how we're defined by Silicon Valley, who creates all these technologies. The users don't necessarily profit in the same way. We get a free product, but we also get some of the downstream cultural, emotional, and mental health effects from our use of these things.
And one of the reviewers said that you make clear that not only are we users, but we're being used.
Yes. Yes, we are basically we're the ore in the mine.
Hmm.
And we don't and again, I think there have been some very radical and some very thoughtful attempts over the last 10, 20 years of critics of technology to try to get us to think of what we're giving away in terms of information about ourselves, in terms of privacy, in terms of the way in which we expect to be able to rely on things that once they disappear or the upgrade happens and it fails, suddenly we're kind of at loose ends. I mean, for me, this is GPS because I don't have a great sense of direction. I was born and raised in Florida. Everything is flat. Like I'm just one of those people who's directionally challenged. I learned to read a map at a young age to try to compensate for that. But for me, if GPS goes out, I mean, if I have a map, I can read it and get to where I'm going. But that I get a little anxiety. I'm so reliant on this extraordinary technology that I now understand it to be a crutch. Do I stop using it? Of course not. I use it all the time. But it
Hmm.
is, again, that's how we should think about these tools. We should always ask if they're taken away, what skills have deteriorated as a result? Our sense of direction, our sense of civility, our sense of patience, all of these things matter in terms of how we live our daily lives.
And I know that some people would say, okay, so some things are being lost and it doesn't really matter. And one of the things you talk about, and you and I as historians, you kind of know this, is the ability to read cursive, right? It's hard to read 18th century uh, manuscripts or anything really before a certain time if you
Right.
can't read cursive. And I know there's a whole conversation going on in this country right now about whether kids should continue to be taught to write in that way. But it's just something as basic as that, that once that's the ability to read that is gone, what have we lost? There's something to that, I think.
So handwriting, I never thought I'd end up writing about cursive when I started working on this book. I was like, I'm going to be writing about all these cutting edge sensors embedded in this or that.
Hmm.
But that became, for me, the more I looked into it, and it was prompted by a very personal experience, which is that when my sons were young in public school, they only got a little bit of cursive. I mean, they were taught some handwriting, and then they did a little bit of cursive, and then they moved straight on into keyboarding, as it's called, or computer skills, whatever. And I thought, oh, well, I guess that makes sense. This is how they do things because they spend so much time using computers later on. And then I thought, but I wonder if it's actually true that it's good that you don't need cursive anymore. And the
Hmm.
more I started looking to the neuroscience research, the child development research, it became clear to me that that wasn't the case. It wasn't any sort of provable fact that cursive handwriting was just an obsolete tool, which is the way it was described by anyone who'd like to move kids straight into keyboards. So starting to go down that rabbit hole of all the research was striking for me because that was a perfect example of a trade-off we made without realizing we were making a trade-off because nobody understood that there are all these implications for future literacy, for critical thinking, for embodied cognition in general when you take cursive out of the equation, to say nothing, as you say, of being able to read our founding documents, which were written in cursive. Um,
Hmm.
a friend just sent me the other day from the National Archives here in Washington, D.C., a job listing that said, you can you read cursive? We have jobs for you because part of the job of these archivists is to file and to, tally documents that, that the archives have in their possession that need to be better recorded. And they're finding young people who can't read the documents. And so they're actually now actively soliciting this as a skill. This used to be something we could take for granted. So that's just one small example of the kind of trade-offs we've made that might have had unintended consequences, and the good news is lots of schools are reverting and looking back at, maybe reintroducing more time spent on cursive handwriting because of its benefits for the students, so that we can change back to some of these older tools if we understand that they're useful and better, or a complement to what we're already doing with computers and screens.
Yeah, one of the things I think you do so well in this book is impress upon us that it's not just some sort of romanticized looking backward. Oh, we should do things differently the way we used to, but there's the cognitive stuff going on here in our
Right.
brains. And there's a whole literature out there about how the internet's rewired our brains. Um, And I hear this all the time because part of this podcast is about books, and a lot of people say, I know you've heard this, you talk about it. People who say, I can't concentrate enough to read. I mean, I mentioned
Hmm.
E.P. Thompson. His book is over 800 pages long. And there are people who
Hmm.
have said to me, if I could read a book that big in my entire lifetime, I would feel as if I had done something. And we see this all the time. Uh, so, as a historian, I have to ask, how much of this is generational? I mean, people said in the 1950s when everybody was sitting in front of the TV that I've lost the ability to focus. I can't, I'm addicted to this thing. I watch it every night. I don't read anymore. Is this just another chapter in a book that we've been going through for a very long time? Or is there something really qualitatively and quantitatively different about the new technology?
I'm going to give a very unsatisfactory answer and say yes and no.
Okay.
Yes, it is actually a chapter and an ongoing story about how people consume information, how they generate knowledge, and understand what is the distinction between information and knowledge. We're now in a very information saturated environment. I would argue. And this is in part because we don't do as much deep reading, which used to just be called reading, and more people did it. We have
Mm-hmm.
more distractions. So we do a lot of surface skimming reading. It's not that people aren't actually reading written words. It's how it's delivered to them like little pellets in a behavioral experiment that B.F. Skinner would have adored with operant conditioning of little TikTok video, little text message, little bits and pieces so we can exist on this surface area where we're still consuming information, but whether that yields the kind of knowledge, insight, long-term wisdom that deep reading does, we now know it doesn't. I mean, as you say, there have been many studies. But I think that the part in which it is qualitatively different is the way our sort of how we model the world we live in, how we understand the world we live in, the habits of mind, that sort of way of consuming information versus earlier eras of deeper reading, a slower pace and a slower volume of information. It changes how we understand the world and our expectations of the world. And what that means is that we are more impatient. We are less willing to tackle really difficult, thorny subjects because habits of mind matter. I mean, what you do on a daily basis forms your character. We've known this since the ancients have warned us about this. So if you spend most of your time, even as someone like I love to read books, but I struggle with this now too because I have to spend a fair amount of my working time looking at more current political issues, and I consume those more online. And it's a very different thing to pick up a book of political philosophy, which I did a couple weeks ago for something I was working on. I was like, I could feel my brain having to go turn down a few notches and just settle and then sit with this stuff and really focus. And it was a great thing to do, but there's that part of my little lizard brain that's like, oh, you have all this other stuff to do. This is taking so much time. But that's the point. So our expectation of time has shifted dramatically. And that's not even generational. That's just how we all exist now, in the present, in the now. We don't look enough towards the past, and we don't sort of revisit things in the same way that we used to. And a lot of that has to do with the decline of deep reading. And it is a real shift. Talk to professors and teachers who see each new crop of students. They will tell you, like, they can't get through even the easy novels that they used to assign 10 years ago, and that's concerning.
And it's interesting because as you point out, they are reading text. Reading text and
Yes.
print are two different things, of course, but it's not that they can't read. It's not
Right.
that they don't read and consume a lot, but
It's
somehow they're
how
not
they
able.
read.
It's how they
Yes.
read. Exactly. One of the things I'll tell you real quick, I always push back a little bit about people in our generation, parents who go, these kids are glued to their phone. I grew up in a house where, if the wall phone rang, you didn't know who was on the other end because they
Right.
didn't even have caller ID, but you always answered it. I don't care.
Hmm.
It doesn't matter if you were watching the television show that was not going to be on again ever, or if it was Christmas morning. If the phone rang, your parents said you have to answer it and you talk politely for as long as those people want to be there. And I always say that generation was glued to the phone too. It's just a different
Yes.
kind of phone. But to your point, it's still that sort of letting technology drive what we do. You make so many interesting points in this book that how this has affected us. One you say is the lost art of waiting. This is fascinating. Talk about this for a little bit.
So again, talking to friends, many of whom work in the technology industry and also academics. I mean, I have a wide range of people who I just would talk to about this stuff. Like, how is your life different than it was 10 years ago? How do you use social media? How do you get your information? How often do you read? And one of the things that everybody brought up unsolicited, unprompted, was I'm so impatient. Like I just always feel like I'm behind the eight ball, trying to catch up. I'm always busy, busy, busy. But it wasn't necessarily linked to the number of tasks they had to complete. And that got me thinking about how we understand time and the incredible ability to time shift with these technologies. You can be anywhere, anytime, you're always on, creates an expectation, though, of immediate responsiveness to things. So what that means is that when you're in a situation where you can't instantly gratify that need to read something online or see what's going on social media or respond instantly to a message, say you're in a traffic jam. Now, you could pick up your phone and do that, but that's not always something you can do if you're driving. Frustrating life experiences that can't be avoided by the use of technology start to drive people crazy. So road rage rates are on the increase. Every year over year, you can see this. Air rage is now a thing, which never existed, maybe because they let everybody smoke on the plane back in the day. But like people get really angry when they're forced into a situation where they can't turn to their device for some sort of distraction or stimulation. Interstitial time, little moments throughout your day that are just, again, fallow, empty moments. You're waiting for the bus. You're waiting at a doctor's appointment for for yourself or a child. We used to have, you could bring a book, read a newspaper. There were things you could do to pass the time. But if you look around now in public space, everybody's passing the time in just about the same way, which is on their phone. So we fill every single moment. And what that means is that, again, back to human nature, back to being embodied physical creatures, when you're put in a situation where you do just have to wait, it's much more difficult to wait. It's why we teach toddlers when they have a tantrum to sit still and get control of their physical bodies and their emotional states, because the mind and the body are connected. Now, our technologies allow our minds to always be away from our physical situations if the situation is uncomfortable. But look, one day we'll get sick. One day, we'll have to wait on a loved one who needs our help. We have to slow down and focus. And we're getting worse at doing that because we've trained ourselves in habits and expectations with these devices to not to expect that, not to practice that. Does that mean I want everyone to sit on well, and actually you'll see these trends online where people are like, I went through a 5-hour airplane flight and I just stared straight ahead. This is this new radical act. I'm not suggesting that's the response. What I'm saying, though, is that people should be aware of their patience and lack of patience, because waiting actually can be a useful and productive tool for creativity, for daydreaming, for all kinds of ways in which, as human beings, we've solved difficult problems and found answers to complex questions when we let our minds have that space and have that patient reflection.
Yeah, it's like having a daily commute in your car and accepting that you use that time for something, listen to a book or meditate, as you say,
Right.
or think through your problems. One of the things that was really interesting, you were talking about people waiting in line at Disney World, for instance, that
Yeah.
you've done that. We've all done things like that. And you said there are two things that really factor into people's ability to wait: fairness and information. This was
Yes.
fascinating to me. Talk about that a little bit, if you will.
So I got to dive into Q psychology, how we wait, how people what scientists have teach us about human behavior when they make people wait and do these fun experiments on them. And so born and raised Floridian, we went to Disney World all the time when they had the Florida days. And when I was a kid, you just stood in line under the sun, broiling, basically waiting for your turn. And it was totally worth it because you're at Disney and you should be very grateful to be at Disney. But when I took my own kids back to Disney World when they were young, I was astonished at the transformation. They understand that people are much less patient and they entertain you along the way in many of these lines. They give you constant updates on how many more minutes till you get to the ride. You can get fast pass and like digitally, hack the lines in ways that I think people really like to do. Some of that gives, I think, I have no problem with some of that. I mean, if it's a more efficient way to move more people through lines, great. But I think it also breeds a false sense of control over time. And that's where we get into some danger zones as human beings. Because if we think we can control our time and someone imposes on it in a way we don't like, we become very angry. And that's what you see with road. That's what you see, again, the expectation that we should always be able to control where we are, who we have to interact with, how long we have to wait, uh, bumps up against real life circumstances. And the results are now kind of unpleasant to see. People don't like to wait. So when what the Q psychologists have found is that, like, if we hate when someone cuts in line, there's this like instant karma people want to see happen when someone cuts in line. And that, again, that speaks to if we're all forced to be in this together and wait, everybody's got to wait their turn. And all of these sort of small impulses, again, many of them are qualitative experiences, but they speak to a larger way of understanding how the world should work versus how much we think we control how it does work. And those distinctions matter when it comes to how we treat each other in public space. We are becoming deeply uncivil, deeply inattentive to others. And the justification is, well, that's a stranger. What? I don't know that person anything. I'm doing my important thing. And if that's your attitude, you're gonna cultivate a society that's quite hostile, that's not actually very well connected, and that is quick to overreact. And I think we see that more often, and that's not just generational. I think that's a real difference between maybe 20 years ago and today.
Hmm. Yeah, you say one of the things people don't mind waiting if there's a sign that says, your wait time is 30 minutes or whatever.
Right,
That okay, I
right,
know I'll do that or I won't do it.
right.
But you're bringing up the idea of attention. You use two words, two phrases, I should say, in the book that really caught my attention. I wrote them down: civil attention and civil inattention. This is directly related to what you're talking about, which is the theme of the whole book. Again, how we interact with each other. Talk about those two things, if you will.
So one of the some of the great work of 20th century sociology was done by theorists and observers who watched how people behave in cities in particular, right? Cities have it's crowded, lots of people doing lots of different things. Almost everyone's a stranger to each other. So it's a very rich environment for studying how people will behave when unexpected things happen. So there are these weird rules that we've devised. So if you are crossing a crosswalk and the person coming towards you bumps you, you bump them, the correct thing to do from a civil standpoint is both apologize. Regardless of who's at fault, you're both supposed to go, oh, sorry. That diffuses a situation that could be hostile. When you step into an elevator, we used to all kind of just make eye contact. You don't have to be, you're in a small space with someone who could be a danger. It's a quick recognition of I'm not a danger to you, you're not a danger to me. And look, I've walked into elevators and turned around and walked right back out when I saw who was standing. I'm like, this seems like something unnerved me. So I didn't take that elevator. So these are situations where we have ways of kind of signaling to each other norms. These are norms, right? Cultural norms. So when we're in public space, we should have a fair amount of attention to what's going on around us. That's completely upended by personal mobile technologies. It started actually with, the Walkman. You put a headphones in, you could tune everyone out, but it's incredibly accelerated by the smartphone. And people just walking around all the time with their earbuds in, listening to their own soundtrack or doing their own thing. What that means is that when we're all sharing space, we're not paying attention. And the message sent, however subtle, however unintended, is you don't matter as much as what I'm doing. Now, in some cases, there's no consequence for that. Like we're all waiting at a delayed airplane gate. Everybody's just kind of passing the time. But when there's a crisis, say like on the BART train in San Francisco, there was a notorious case where guys waving a gun around in the car, nobody noticed. They were all hunched over their phones, doing their own thing, and he's standing there with a gun. That was striking because people didn't realize just how inattentive they had become because of cultivating these daily habits with their phones. So I worry about what that means for civic responsibility and civic order. There is something deeply alienating about not being acknowledged by another human being. I interviewed a lot of people who work retail for this book, and they all said the same thing, whether it was a high-end boutique or a fast food restaurant. They're like, people don't look you in the eye and even acknowledge you anymore. They come in, they get their order. It's like you're not a human being. It's like we're being looked right through. And that worries me. That's not how we should treat each other, regardless of how, mundane that experience might be of picking up your coffee at a Starbucks. Look someone in the eye, like acknowledge their existence. That's very important.
Hmm. Uh, Side note here, I had the ability last week or so to look at an application for working at Chick-fil-A. And one of the things it said is the ability to create and maintain eye contact.
Yes, it has to be. Yes.
You wouldn't think that was something you would need to, but that just jumped out at me because I thought that tells me that there are plenty of people who can, and that's something they feel like they need to at least teach or that you need to be able. It does make some people very uncomfortable to be looked at.
It
or
is
to
it's funny, the one of the examples, sort of an extreme, but I think I used it to try to acknowledge why she even did this. The artist Marina Abramovich, who does sort of performance art, she did an entire exhibit where she went, I think it was the Museum of Modern Art. She just sat in a chair and there was another chair opposite her, and you could come and sit for as long as you want, for as briefly as you wanted, and she would look you right in the eye. And the she did this, I think, as a it was a performance, but it was also a sort of acknowledgement of this is how people acknowledge each other. Why does it make us so uncomfortable to do that in public with a stranger anymore? And it was fascinating to me to listen to the descriptions of the people's reactions to participating in that work of art. But to your point, I talk to people who work in diplomacy, and they all discuss this across the board. They're like, no matter how well educated or how elite or how whatever these kids are coming through the pipeline, they lack those social skills. They lack the ability to simply engage with another human being whom they've never met before and they need to make important small talk with because we're all about to have a big important diplomatic meeting with, a potentially hostile foreign country or even an ally. Like those are really deeply important skills that cannot be outsourced to apps. So the fact that we're now seeing, can you read cursive? You do know you need to make eye contact. Here's how you shake someone's hand and introduce yourself properly. These skills, that's a sign that we've allowed these deeply important human skills to deteriorate, and we need to revive them. We need to remind people that that's actually part of that's just as important to your job as knowing how the most recent software that your profession uses, how it works. Just as important, if not arguably more, because it leads to a better environment both in the workplace and outside of it where people connect. And that's actually ultimately what was the promise of many of these new technologies.
hmm and that goes to the heart of the question of the fact that a lot of people in our society that we live in today do not want to connect. They like that distance, that there's a screen between us. I'm going to keep my camera off. We saw this a lot, of course, during the pandemic with schools. Part of it is that you're not only not interacting with other people your own age, but the teachers that can just hide behind this. And so what you're describing there is not just a matter of function of youth, people who just don't know how to shake hands and whatnot, but that even people beyond that just don't want to do that anymore. It makes them, that human contact makes them uncomfortable. And we're not talking about just introverts and extroverts. It's just basic human contact.
It is the easier path. I mean, and I think during COVID, you saw a lot of adults who were able to hide behind their screens and found it much more convenient to be sort of isolated from whatever environment they'd been in before. And look,
Mm-hmm.
that it was an emergency. I understand all that. But after COVID, the expectation was that people would be glad to be back, go into the
Mm-hmm.
office. And that hasn't proven to be the case. And that
Mm-hmm.
did not surprise me because long before COVID, you saw these patterns of behavior where people were spending less face-to-face time together, even with their friends. I mean, this forget the office. Like, everyone wants to escape the office, but they were not gathering together and meeting face to face with their friends. The same is true for sort of leaving your house to say, go look at a work of art or go to a concert versus being able to just stream something, online, which is much easier. So the ease and the convenience are going to almost always, given human nature, what people choose. And so now you have to actively choose the more difficult, but ultimately, I would say qualitatively better experience in many cases. And this is particularly true when you start tracking how much time Americans spend alone in all age groups. I mean, particularly among the young, but you can see it across the board. More and more people are spending more time alone because they have plenty to entertain themselves with. I mean, many people can do their jobs from home. They can entertain themselves from home, talk to their friends, through a screen or through FaceTime. And but the entire time they're physically isolated. And that actually, we do know, has long-term implications for people's sense of well-being, obviously for their physical health if they're too sedentary, and for their mental health, because there is something special about being in the physical presence of another human being, because it's not just seeing their face, although the face is a very powerful tool for communication. It's just simply not. There's a way in which conversation flows in person, and you can't escape it because you're there, you're stuck with this person.
Mm-hmm.
And it's much more rich and rewarding for people to have those in-person experiences. And again, I got people will poo-poo me and say, well, but I have a friend who lives on the other side of the world who I otherwise wouldn't see. I'm like, that's great. That's where the tool is really, really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Friends who have, kids on the other side of the world and they get to FaceTime with them all the time. Like, that's fantastic. I'm not arguing to eliminate that. it's monitoring our own behavior when we start to find ourselves choosing the easier path of not leaving the house, not
Hmm.
getting out from behind the screen and going out in the real world and engaging with it. That's where I think we all have a tipping point, and we're starting to tip too far into preferring the not in person, to preferring the mediated experience because it's easier, it's more under our control. It's something that allows us to withdraw from the risk of interaction and from the rewards as well, unfortunately.
Hmm. Right. You begin the book and some talking about the ability to read facial cues. Right. This is part of
Yes.
being human, being able to. We use the phrase "read the room," but when you're having an
Mhm.
interaction with somebody, maybe you see that they're bored, maybe they don't like what you're saying, and you only get that by actually, first of all, make like you said, making eye contact, looking at someone to see how they react to what you say. One of the things you say, again, in the middle of the book, that all of this has to do with being human. You say discovering who we are takes time, and that when we rely on this technology to sort of tell us who we are, this is your algorithm. This is what you
Mhm.
prefer. This is what you like. This is what you want to look at. These are the people you want to interact with. You've lost that sort of discovering for yourself that you've talked about. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Yes, one of the that observation for me came out of looking at what technologies, some of the futuristic technologies that a lot of our technologists are working on. If you want to really scare yourself, just peruse the patent applications is what I would tell you. You would be amazed at what's actually already in process, what's been applied for with patents. But I was especially interested in the kind of sensor-based technologies that can be embedded in a phone or actually put on your person, like if you have a smartwatch or something like that, that monitor, heart rate, blood pressure, galvanic skin response, all kinds of stuff that can be monitored. But they're very sophisticated now. They can monitor the number of words you speak, your tone of voice, all kinds of things that actually speak to your emotional state moment by moment. So the argument is, and a lot of the people who initially developed these tools use them to help with people who are, say, neuroatypical, sort of to teach them to read social cues so they can get feedback like, oh, when you were talking to this person, you were fidgety or you said fewer words. It can help them understand their own situation. For that, I don't have a problem. But that's not what the technologists ultimately want to do with these tools. What they want to do is tell us that we don't know ourselves. And by that, I mean there's an entire field of persuasive technology and monitoring technology. And one of its biggest promoters and developers wrote a book called Honest Signals, Alex Pentland. And a fascinating book. But he basically believes we're constantly fooling ourselves about how we really feel. And he would like us to be more rational and honest. And the only way to do that is to have sensors and monitors actually tell us how we really feel moment by moment. So say we are having a conversation and you start to get a little annoyed because I'm talking too much, but you're not showing me. You're being very polite, a thoughtful host. If you had these sensors on though, they could be saying in real time, she's getting annoying. Your blood pressure is starting to rise. You're really annoyed. How would that help our relationship and conversation? I would argue it wouldn't. It might undermine it because um, it leads to a kind of observation. It's actually civil to try to like tamp down our initial reactions to people or our annoyance with people. It's sort of a muscle we build. People like Pentland and a lot of technologists say, no, that's dishonest. And they would like to sell this to employers who would like to monitor their employees in situations where they think they could make them, again, more efficient,
Hmm.
more honest, track their behavior, make sure they're doing what they say they do. That worries me from a sort of libertarian standpoint about, the invasion of privacy. So there are all these ways in which we're being trained in habits of mind that make us mistrust our own instincts. Some of our human instincts are terrible and we should question them. But to rely and outsource to technology that important life skill worries me.
Because as you say, having to deal as an adult with other people who might be annoying is part of being an adult, and not just going, you're really bothering me. I mean,
Right.
don't just say
My
the
my
first thing
app
that.
says I should eliminate you're toxic.
Yeah.
I'm going to eliminate you
Hmm.
from my circle of
Yeah.
friends.
And I didn't know it. I didn't think about it before, but now I know this. And this is the heart of one of the other questions I wanted to ask you. And you just sort of talked about it, but it's the sense that you say if earlier technologies were an extension of our senses, the telephone, for instance, that I mentioned at the very beginning, we can connect across time and space. Today's technologies train us to mistrust our own senses and rely instead on technology. And I know people who don't talk to real therapists anymore. You even talk about this. They talk to AI,
Hmm.
who somehow will be able to intuit their problems and help them through life better than a human being.
Yeah, so the AI chat therapy world, which is exploding right now, I think one of the
Mm-hmm.
more popular ones is actually called Woebot, Woebot. This bothers me for two reasons. One, it's going to create a class system for human care, in the sense that if you're wealthy and you want to see a human therapist who actually takes the time and builds a relationship with you over time in person, you're going to have to be wealthy to afford that, because it's a lot cheaper to just let loose a sort of AI generated therapy bot on for thousands of patients than it is to actually have that sort of important working relationship with a therapist. But more importantly, I think the people receiving the help, and they're just now in the early stages of starting to study the results of some of these. For certain mild phobias, for example, the chatbots can be helpful because it gets people sort of to think through why they're having the reactions they do. But for people who are struggling with mental health, serious mental health issues, human therapy is much, much better. But human therapists also tend to hold you accountable in a way, because they take no one worries about whether their chatbot therapist is mulling over their personality or likes or dislikes when they're off the clock. But if you have a therapist and you're struggling with something, you might think, I wonder what they really think of me. I wonder if they really understand me. I mean, but that is actually an important human relationship, particularly with people who are doing things like cognitive behavioral therapy, other things that which really require a lot of human accountability and feedback and encouragement. Um, I don't think we should outsource that to a bot or to no matter how sophisticated, because the those bots are feeding off of human knowledge in order to be created and be useful, and humans connect to things. And I don't think it's good for someone struggling with any sort of mental health issue to connect to an AI chatbot rather than another human being, because at some point they're going to really need a human in their life to help them through whatever they're struggling with. And a chatbot's not going to, call 911, maybe it can call 911, I don't know, but it's not going to actually be a presence, a physical presence in that person's life when they might most need a hug, for example, or just
Mm-hmm.
a reassuring pat on the back that you've got this. They're just all of these ways in which, as humans, we connect with our physical bodies in person that is irreplaceable. And the idea that we should replace it with something, again, more efficient, more algorithmically sophisticated, I don't think that's the answer. And we've seen this with, for example, sentencing algorithms in the criminal justice system, which this was a similar argument. Oh, they're going to be more objective. They're going to take in all these factors a human brain can't. It's just going to be so much better, more just. That has not been the case, because they have been applied in a way and designed in a way that incorporates a lot of bias, and that really does alleviate the sense of justice and responsibility from the human beings who are passing judgment on others' freedom and life. And that is a human decision. That should always be a human decision.
There's so many little gems in your book that I wrote down that it's not as if we don't know this, but I hadn't really thought about it before. You said it's easier physically to send a message to the other side of the world than it is to tie your own shoe. And I've dropped that on people and they're like, oh my God, that's so true. In the old days, if somebody went to London, for instance, you might be able to write them a postcard or wait until they got back. And it's so easy to
Yeah.
connect with those people. And you're right, it takes more effort to bend over than it does to send a text.
Well, this is part of the effort by, I think, Silicon Valley to get us to forget that we are trapped in our frail and time-limited human forms. Our physical bodies have an expiration date, no matter what the people who want to upload consciousness and singularity and all that stuff and live forever. And it
Hmm.
is, I think, very important to note that all of those schemes to extend life well beyond what we know is possible do come out of that same environment that produces all of these technologies. Look, helping people have longer, healthier, more vigorous lifespans, that's fantastic. That's what modern medicine has been trying to do for a very long time. But understanding human limitations is actually what allows us philosophically and culturally to reckon with what's important, to even determine what's important, right? You
Hmm.
look at your children and you think about their children and their children, and then you think, you know what, I want to invest in policies that are going to make a better world for them, and even long past the time I'm gone. I want to leave the world a better place because I know I'm leaving it.
Hmm.
And that sense, I think, is really dulled by the promise of our technologies. It comes roaring back into people's lives when they get sick or they break something or they suddenly realize, like, oh my goodness, I'm mortal. Um, And I do think when you look at all these sort of cultural trend stories about people sort of living extended youth, this is a country now, and like a lot of Western countries, people are not settling down. They are not getting married. They're not having as many kids. There's a mindset of sort of perpetual nowness, perpetual youth, perpetual living in the moment. And that's not good for humanity. It's certainly
Hmm.
not good for a society that wants to build things and really cultivate trust. We have all of these things are linked to an understanding of how the world works and how it should work and how we want it to work. And our bodily limitations are at the core of that. Our recognition of human frailty should be at the core of that and should guide our decision making on a lot of these complicated issues.
Hmm. You have a discussion of what you call temporal bias, which is what you're
Yes.
talking about. That the
Yes.
now is really the most important thing in the world.
Right.
Another thing you said, and if you didn't act, if you were quoting somebody, sorry, I'm going to still give you credit for these. Attention is the rarest form of generosity.
Simone Weil. Yes. That to me, I know your listeners are probably familiar. There've been a bunch of wonderful and some not so wonderful, but a lot of books about attention in the last 10, 15 years as we
Hmm.
struggle with the power of these tools to distract us from lots of things. But what struck me about that observation is that the word human, right? It's that we give our attention to things that matter to us, but in return, we are giving another human being something that is limited, that we only have a certain amount of, and that they in return also have a finite amount of. So when you choose to spend your time in the presence of other people, giving and taking, whether that's at work, whether that's in your home life or with your friends, um, that is an act of generosity. When you intervene in those moments by distracting yourself with your phone or uh, only giving partial attention to the people you love because, oh, this text just came through from work, we all can rationalize why we do it, but you are limiting your generosity towards others. You are limiting your what you are giving, and as a result we often get less in return. And so I think for me that it is the one, because we are finite and limited creatures, it is the one thing we do have control over. What do we focus on? What do we give our attention to? How do we spend our time? And those questions should guide every single discussion of how we embrace new technologies. Does it reflect my values? Does it reflect what I want for my family and community? And if it doesn't, saying no, I'm not going to adopt this new thing even though it's more efficient, because actually dinner table conversation shouldn't be efficient. It should be wide ranging. Pace should be slow. It should be a time for everyone to contribute and think about their day. How many families sit down and have dinner together every night anymore? Very few. So
Hmm.
again, cultivating attention means giving up other things, and I think it's worth it to for people to ask what they can and should give up if the reward is genuine and focused attention on each other.
That word you used, efficient. I mean, that comes through this whole thing, right? That so much of this is driven. And I'm going to be mindful of your time and to wrap this up. But the idea that all of this is about efficiency, and some things in life shouldn't be efficient, as you just said,
Mm,
right? Some things that are very
exactly.
meaningful. My favorite one, I have two things left. Smiles are social acts with consequences.
Yes, this is funny. I have some friends spent a little time in Japan, and then I have friends in Europe who are always joking about how Americans smile too much. Y'all always smiling. What's like it's so weird. Like it's weird how much you smile, and I'm a smiler. So I always push back on them. I'm like it's a sign of openness to what's coming at you, right? It's like I'm not a danger, but I'm welcoming, your feedback. And it's why there are all these fun examples. Again, I got to go down this interesting rabbit hole of like, why do some people's smiles creep us out? Again, it's because we register without knowing why we know it if a smile is fake. Because the eyes don't wrinkle in quite the same way. And so sociopaths have a different way of smiling than normal people. Politicians who have perhaps become too robotic in their public facing roles have slow, weird, creepy smiles sometimes. I mean, it's just, we register the smile as something natural or not. And this is why we have this term, the uncanny valley, when it comes to robotics. So no matter how sophisticated some of these robots that are being developed, there is that moment where the human brain goes, that's like, wow, it looks really real. And then suddenly it becomes very unnerving. And that's because there's something about as basic as the human smile that can look quite creepy if it's not backed by the actual honest emotion that should be behind a smile.
Hmm. And I read your book and then immediately read Oliver Burkeman's book, 4,000 Weeks, and they really
Yes.
work
Oh, I
well
love his
together.
stuff.
And
Yeah.
that's not a plug for his book, but
Oh, I'll plug his book. He's fantastic. Everyone should
yeah,
read
I
his
mean,
stuff.
because what you're getting at is what do we give our time to and how much of
Yes.
our lives do we give to it and how much privacy, et cetera. So here's the end question, and I'm sure you've been asked this many times, and that is, physician, heal thyself. Christine Rosen, how have you absorbed the lessons of your book? And they are many, or how have you tried to? I mean, you're as human as all the rest of us, but how have you tried to incorporate these into your life?
So I've never gone on social media. So that's one thing. I started
Mm-hmm.
studying it very early on, had friends who worked in the industry very early on, and I very
Mm.
quickly thought, and again, not because I'm some saint who is just better than everybody who's on social media. Not at all. First of all, I have a job that doesn't require me to really be on it. Some people don't have that option. But also I know myself. Like I would have been fired if I went on social media because as my friends can attest, when I like to like joke around and like I would have said something like that online and that would have been the end for me. So I understood my limitations to self-censor. So I was like, this is not a platform for me. I'm better off thinking through before I spout off. So that's one thing that's actually made it easier for me. I have friends who will let me use their profiles and so that I spend a lot of time on social media as a user, but it's not me. It's my friends allowing me to be they're my avatar and I can explore. So that's been a really important thing. I have really, really tried to exercise some discipline in my reading for pleasure over the last couple of years in particular. I read a lot for work, which isn't always for pleasure, and
Mm-hmm.
I have really tried to expand. I read a lot of fiction and translation last year. This year I'm going back to more classics that I might have skimmed or overlooked when I was younger. And it takes a huge amount of discipline because there's a lot of great TV and movies to watch. There's tons of great content out there, but I really want to maintain and cultivate my habit of deep reading because it really makes me a happier person. It just does. Like I'm just
Mm-hmm.
happier when I read that way. So that's another thing I do. The third thing I do is I have a hobby that doesn't allow for any mediation. I teach and train in martial arts. And we all have to, when we come on the mats in the dojo, our existence outside of the dojo ends. We are all the same, and we everything's done in Japanese, and it's very formal, but it allows me, and it's all with your physical body, but also with your mind. And so for me, it's a perfect practice of embodied cognition because I'm thinking and concentrating, but I'm also using my body, and I'm not. You really can't focus on anything else, both because you could get hurt or you could hurt your training partner, but also because you're in the moment. And for me, that's a practice and a habit and a routine I've done it for 11 years now, has really helped me cultivate that part of being human. And for every person, it's going to be different. I have friends who are big knitters, another who does that with cooking. So I would encourage people to find that thing that isn't sitting at a screen. I mean, video gaming is fun for a lot of people, but then find something in the real world that's also physically and mentally challenging that you can do for pleasure and cultivate those wonderful hobbies and routines.
And I think this is a fight that's not going to get any easier as we go
No,
along.
you have to defend the human. You have to actively choose the human thing now because all the deck is stacked against that. It's stacked towards mediating your experience all the time.
The book is entitled The Extinction of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World. The author is Christine Rosen. Christine, thank you so much for giving your time and coming on here, and continued good luck in waging this battle and bringing our attention to it.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
My thanks to Christine Rosen for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about her book at www.norton.com. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, the czar of our Tallahassee office, as well as the captain of the Off the Beaten Path horseback boxing team, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Crellin. All guest accommodations on Off the Beaten Path provided by the Horseshoe Road Inn. Our Off the Beaten Path fact checker is Ella Fino. The director of accounts payable is Bill Schroeder. Our air quality monitor is Carmine Dioxide. Our staff snowplow driver in this week's snowstorm is Fraser Tushoff. Our director of employee loyalty is Upton Leftus. Our staff layoff specialist is Harry Verderci, assisted by layoff counselor Oscar Lavista. Our door-to-door sales coordinator is Annie Von Holm. The staff physicist is Momentum. Our Russian chauffeur is Pick Up and Drop Off. Our financial advisors are provided by the firm of Ilgott and Gaines. Our staff bus driver is bored and drowsy. The Off the Beaten Path nightclub manager is Don Cashane. Our in-house literary critic is Al Ligori. The holiday wardrobe consultant is Don Wienow. Our staff director of Three Stooges Studies is Lee Iappoca. Dr. Todd Gross's personal eBay specialist is Selma Junkoff. And our Off the Beaten Path martini mixer, thank you very much, is Olive Twist. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including now on YouTube and YouTube Music. Please follow, like, and share. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app. That would be most appreciated and helpful. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. You can learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Please also visit the official Off the Beaten Path website at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out my videos, my blog, and similar remediation podcasts like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.